So in terms of how to use it exactly, I recommend two ways. You can listen to this podcast actively, or you can listen to it passively. So when I say actively, I mean that you sit down, put your headphones in, pull up the transcript, and listen and do nothing else. That's active listening. Of course, that's fantastic. That's very helpful if you can do that, right? That will be the most beneficial way for you to listen to this podcast. And when you do that, you can read the transcript or you can just listen to the podcast. It depends on how you want to use it, how much you understand. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But before that, I want to talk about passive listening. So if you don't have a bunch of free time, but you still want to practice your English listening, you can listen to this podcast passively. What does that mean? Well, while you're doing something else, for example, driving to work, washing the dishes, cleaning the house, exercising, things like that, where you're doing one thing, but your brain is free, you can use that time to listen to this podcast passively. You can use this podcast during that time, and of course, you won't be 100% focused on the podcast. You won't be 100% focused on what you're listening to, but you'll still be able to listen, learn new vocabulary, train your listening, etc. So you can listen to the podcast actively or passively or both. So in terms of the transcript, right, you might ask, how do I use the transcript? Well, let me tell you how I use transcripts when I do my listening practice, when I learn languages. So what I do is, if I have the transcript to an audio, I read the transcript first and I look up any new words that I don't know. And then after that, I listen to the audio with the transcript. However, if the audio is at a level that's somewhat easy for me, if it's not too difficult, or if the subject is very familiar to me, then sometimes I'll just listen to the podcast the first time without the transcript. I'll listen to the audio the first time without reading it. You'll know, based on your level, how you can go about listening the first time, right? If you have a higher level, like B1, maybe you want to try listening without the transcript the first time. Or if you have a lower level, like an A2 level, maybe you'll want to start with the transcript. However, regardless of whether you use the transcript the first time or no, or whether you do it like me and you read the whole transcript the first time before listening to the podcast, regardless of what you do, what I really recommend that you do is repeat, right? Listen to the same podcast episode multiple times. This is what I do when I'm practicing my listening in other languages. I listen to the same audio 3, 4, 5, even 10 times sometimes. And the reason I do this is because when you repeat an audio like that, or when you read something again and again, what happens is that your brain starts to acquire the new vocabulary, the new phrases, the grammatical structures. Really, you don't even realize it's happening, but it happens. when I do this repetition with my listening practice, I realize that I don't have to write down any new vocabulary. When I repeat the same audio 5 times, for example, by the end of the 5th time, I realize that I remember the new words. I remember the new phrases. I can use the new grammatical structures. I realize that my brain is capturing all this through the repetition. So now when I do my listening practice, I never have to write lists of vocabulary words. I never do that anymore. In the past, before I used this repetition technique, I always did that. I always had lists of vocabulary. But now I don't. Now I remember all of the new vocabulary, all of the new phrases, as long as I repeat the same audio many times. So I recommend you listen to each episode multiple times, right? With the transcript, without the transcript, or the way I do it is I first read the transcript, then I listen with the transcript a couple times, and then I listen without the transcript a couple times. And this is extremely helpful for me. So I recommend you do this as well. And you might say, wow, it's a little boring to listen to the same thing multiple times. I understand that. Hopefully, I'll be able to find interesting topics to talk about so that it won't be too boring to repeat the same podcast. Hopefully, you'll like the topics I choose, and they'll be everyday, contemporary topics or other types of topics, but in general, hopefully they'll be interesting. And you can always request new topics if you want me to talk about a specific subject.